It's surprising to me how many people think that there's conflict between science and the Christian faith. In fact, many skeptics would argue that there's good reasons to view the creation accounts in Genesis with suspicion. For example, they would argue that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are separate and contradictory accounts of creation, and therefore we should simply reject the Christian faith because of that. But is this really the case? I'm joined today by Dr. Ken Keithley, who is a Christian scholar and a professor of theology at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, to help address this question. Ken, what is the right way to understand Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? How do these two creation accounts relate to each other, or do they relate to each other at all?
Yeah, well, you have a lot of folk who have said through the years that you have two creation accounts tied together very poorly. You don't hear that kind of thing said very often among Old Testament scholars today. In fact, what we find whenever one looks at the literary structure of the Pentateuch as a whole, that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, they realize that as a literary work, it's put together very intricately, and it's a work of literary genius. So rather, I mean, the opinion of the relationship of Genesis 1 and 2 has shifted 180 degrees from viewing it as a poor patchwork to now as a literary masterpiece. So there's been a real change. How did this come about? Well, I think one of the problems is that the fact that it's called Genesis 1 and 2 at all. Let's remember that the chapter divisions and the verse divisions that we see in the Bible were not added until not just century, but millennia after Genesis was written. It was the chapter and verse divisions weren't added until the medieval period. So if we were to let Moses himself divide the chapters in the book of Genesis, how many chapters would there be? And the answer is there would be 10. There is this Toledot expression. These are the generations of, and then it would go on. And it says that 10 times. And so Old Testament scholars are in agreement that one should understand the book of Genesis to have 10 chapters, 10 sections. So with that in mind, where would chapter 1 begin? Well, it would begin in Genesis 2 at about the 3rd and 4th verse. That's where chapter 1 would begin. Well, because that's where you have, and these are the generations of the heaven and the earth, and then it goes through Genesis 2. So what then is what we today call Genesis 1? What is that? Well, it's a prologue. It's an introduction. It's a great overview it's letting Israel know that the story that you have in Genesis 2, where God is establishing the land for Israel, that's what Eden is. It's the beginning of the promised land. And let's remember, Genesis 1 and 2 is the beginning of the Pentateuch, and the Pentateuch operates as a unit in which it tells the story about how the people of God lost the land and how they recovered it. That's the storyline. That's the arc that one sees in the Pentateuch. So, what is Genesis 1 doing? It's letting the people of Israel know that the God of Israel, who is entered into a special relationship with them about this unique land, they're not to see him as a parochial deity, but he's actually, according to the introduction, the one who created everything, the heavens and the earth. And so it's an introduction or prologue. And it operates in the same way that John's gospel operates. If you think about the Gospel of John, how does John's gospel begin? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:1 sounds like Genesis 1:1 on purpose. That's what John was doing. He was fashioning his gospel, modeling it on the book of Genesis. And so what do you have in John's gospel? The first 18 verses are prologue, overview, that gives you a general introduction that then moves into the story that we read in John chapter 2. That is what happens in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 is this overarching grand narrative. This is where we're going with the story. And then in chapter 2, it zeroes down and focuses in to the land. So what Genesis 1 and 2 are not two creation accounts, But chapter 1 is a grand narrative that lets us know that the creator of the heavens and the earth in chapter 2 has zeroed down and focused into a relationship with the people of God, Adam and Eve, who will then, as we see throughout the whole Pentateuch, God will continue to have a people for himself and bringing them back to the land. That's the much better way of understanding what's going on.
Is that why you see different names for God in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, Elohim and Yahweh?
Actually, in Genesis 2, and I'm glad you brought that up, is because you have a very unique combination of Yahweh Elohim. In fact, there's only one other place that you find that in the Old Testament. What is he doing there? You have in chapter 1, he's Elohim, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, when God reveals himself to Moses, and Moses says, well, who shall I say sent me? Yahweh. So he has his covenant name with him. Well, in Genesis 2, you have where it's Yahweh Elohim who is doing this work. The Elohim, the God, and that's what the word Elohim, it's the generic word. It's like our word for God. The God who created in chapter 1 is none other than our covenant God that we read in chapter 2. And what the account is letting Israel know is that yes, Israel, Yahweh is your God, and he has given you this land. But he's not local. He's not parochial. He's not small. You shouldn't think of him as your deity the same way the Canaanites think they have Baal, or the way that the Babylonians think they have Marduk. No, he has entered into a relationship with you, but understand he is the great creator God.